It's Sunday, the 19th of July. I'm Laura Cornfield, and this is IBA News, broadcasting from Jerusalem. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu continued to attack the nuclear deal signed last week between the West and Iran, telling the cabinet ministers this morning that the Islamic Republic deserved no concessions until it changed its policy and ceased its call for the destruction of the United States and Israel. Here with more is IBA's Eli Walgelanter.
Prime Minister Netanyahu said this morning that those who thought signing a nuclear deal with Iran would cause the Islamic Republic to temper its extremism were proven wrong over the weekend. Speaking at the weekly cabinet meeting, Netanyahu said that Iran is boasting that it will use the millions of dollars it gets from the deal to fund terror. If anyone thought that Iran's exaggerated concessions will change its policy, they received a defiant response this weekend with the aggressive and adversarial speech by Iran's leader Khamenei, Netanyahu told his ministers. The Iranians are not even trying to hide the fact that they will use the hundreds of millions that they will get from this deal in order to arm their terror machine, and they say outright that they will continue their fight against the United States and its allies, Israel being chief among them. This was Netanyahu's first response following yesterday's inflammatory speech by Khamenei, in which the Iranian leader stated that the Islamic Republic's policies toward the U.S. have not changed. We have repeatedly said we don't negotiate with the U.S. on regional or international affairs, not even on bilateral issues, said Khamenei. There are some exceptions, like the nuclear program that we negotiated with the Americans to serve our interests. And Khamenei said he wanted politicians to examine the agreement to ensure national interests were preserved, as Iran would not allow the disruption of its revolutionary principles or defensive abilities, and that the death to America, death to Israel chants will continue as they reflect the views of the Iranian people. Netanyahu also answered his critics, such as U.S. President Barack Obama, who have accused him of slamming the deal without offering a better plan of his own. Said Netanyahu, the alternative that we have suggested time after time to this failure of a deal is a continuation of and strengthening of the sanctions against Iran. As long as Iran encourages cries of death to America and death to Israel, there is no reason to give them any concessions. Laura?
Thank you, Eli. The cabinet meeting came after Obama offered another lengthy defense of the Iran deal, criticizing those who disagree in a disparaging way.
This deal will make America and the world safer and more secure. Still, you're going to hear a lot of overheated and often dishonest arguments about it in the weeks ahead. So today I want to take a moment to take those on one by one and explain what this deal does and what it means. First, you'll hear some critics argue that this deal somehow makes it easier for Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon. Now, if you think it sounds strange that the United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, Russia, China, and some of the world's best nuclear scientists would agree to something like that, you're right. This deal actually closes off Iran's pathway to a nuclear weapon. Today, Iran has enough nuclear material to produce up to 10 nuclear weapons. With this deal, they'll have to ship 98% of that material out of the country, leaving them with a fraction of what it takes to make even one weapon. With this deal, they'll have to repurpose 2 key nuclear facilities, so they can't produce materials that could be used for a nuclear weapon. So this deal actually pushes Iran further away from a bomb. And there is a permanent prohibition on Iran ever having a nuclear weapon. Second, you might hear from critics that under this deal, Iran could just ignore everything that's required and do whatever they want, that they're inevitably going to cheat. Well, that criticism's wrong too. With this deal, we will have unprecedented 24/7 monitoring of Iran's key nuclear facilities. With this deal, international inspectors will have access to Iran's entire nuclear supply chain. The verification process set up by this deal is comprehensive and it is intrusive, precisely so we can make sure Iran keeps its commitments. Third, you might hear from critics that Iran faces no consequences if it violates this deal. That is also patently false. If Iran violates this deal, the sanctions we imposed that have helped cripple the Iranian economy, the sanctions that helped make this deal possible, would snap back into place promptly. There's a reason this deal took so long to negotiate. Because we refused to accept a bad deal. We held out for a deal that met every one of our bottom lines, and we got it. Does this deal resolve all of the threats Iran poses to its neighbors in the world? No. Does it do more than anyone has done before to make sure Iran does not obtain a nuclear weapon? Yes. and that was our top priority from the start. That's why it's in everyone's best interest to make sure this deal holds, because without this deal, there would be no limits on Iran's nuclear program. There would be no monitoring, no inspections. The sanctions we rallied the world to impose would unravel. Iran could move closer to a nuclear weapon. Other countries in the region might race to do the same, and we'd risk another war in the most volatile region in the world. That's what would happen without this deal. On questions of war and peace, we should have tough, honest, serious debates. We've seen what happens when we don't. That's why this deal is online for the whole world to see. I welcome all scrutiny. Fear no questions. As Commander-in-Chief, I make no apology for keeping this country safe and secure through the hard work of diplomacy over the easy rush to war.
Meanwhile, the media face-off between the American administration and Israeli opponents of the deal continues. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and Prime Minister Netanyahu both gave a series of interviews over the weekend to American news outlets in favor and against the accord. Speaking to PBS, Kerry once again defended the agreement and insisted that Israel will be safer under its terms.
To Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday, I've talked to him regularly throughout this process, and we are absolutely, by far, more linked day to day in the security relationship with Israel than at any time in history. President Obama is prepared to upgrade that, to work to do more, to be able to address specific concerns. But we still believe that Israel will be safer with a one-year breakout for the 10 years than 2 months. Now, there's no alternative being provided by all these other people. They all say, oh, why didn't you crush them with the sanctions? I'll tell you why. Because they won't be crushed by sanctions. That's been proven. And because we'll lose the other people who are helping to provide those sanctions. They're not going to do that if Iran is willing to make a reasonable agreement. So there's a lot of fantasy out there about this, quote, better deal. The fact is that we spent 4 years putting together an agreement that had the consent of Russia, China, France, Germany, Great Britain, and Iran. That is not easy, and I believe the agreement we got withstands scrutiny and will deliver an Iran that cannot get a nuclear weapon.
Minister Yuval Steinitz angrily responded to the Secretary of State's claims.
Heard the Secretary of State claim that a better agreement with Iran is a mere fantasy. With all due respect, I totally reject this. According to our analysis, one can easily think of a much better agreement with Iran. For example, an agreement that will enable inspectors to verify suspicions in military sites not after 24 days, but in 24 hours.
In Gaza, at least 2 people were reportedly injured this morning when a series of mysterious car explosions went off simultaneously. 6 vehicles belonging to members of Hamas and Islamic Jihad were detonated outside the homes of their owners in the Strip's Sheikh Radwan neighborhood, which is considered a Hamas stronghold. Graffiti showing the ISIS logo was found written on one of the homes. As of this hour, no group has claimed responsibility for the attack. An Al Jazeera correspondent in the area reported that Hamas closed off access to the site and barred entry to journalists. Turning to the shooting death of 5 U.S. servicemen in Chattanooga, Tennessee, the FBI is investigating the incident as an act of terrorism, but said it is premature to speculate on the gunman's motive. However, evidence is mounting that the suspect, Mohammed Yosef Abdelaziz, a 24-year-old Kuwaiti-born naturalized U.S. citizen whose parents are Palestinian, was upset about Operation Protective Edge in Gaza last summer and the civil war in Syria. Friends said that Abdulaziz became more concerned about his heritage during a stay in Jordan last year and returned to the U.S. upset about the reluctance of the American government to help the Arab masses. Another friend said that on the morning of the shooting, he received a text message from Abdulaziz that included an Islamic verse that said, "Whomever shows enmity to a friend of mine, then I have declared war against him." A front-page picture in the British tabloid The Sun showing previously unknown footage of Queen Elizabeth II performing a Nazi salute as a 7-year-old child has generated much controversy. The footage is over 8 decades old, and Buckingham Palace is not pleased with the release of the images, as we hear in this report from CBS.
The home video obtained by British tabloid The Sun shows the young queen and her sister waving to the camera in their garden 82 years ago. The Queen's mother then raises her hand in what appears to be the Nazi salute. Queen Elizabeth, then a 7-year-old princess, mimics the gesture, followed by her uncle, Prince Edward. The film has raised eyebrows, but royal supporters say it was taken in 1933, long before the atrocities of World War II came into focus.
Hitler been in power probably for about 6 months. Princess Elizabeth is 7, Princess Margaret is 3.
Dickie Arbiter is the former press secretary to the Queen.
Nobody knew what was in store until very much later in the 30s.
That's when public opinion towards Hitler evolved. Case in point, in 1938, England's soccer team came under fire for giving the salute before a game in Berlin. But public opinion didn't stop Prince Edward from flirting with fascism. He soon became a known Nazi sympathizer. In 1937, after abdicating to marry Wallis Simpson, Edward visited Hitler and spent time with his troops. The Sun's managing editor, Stig Abel, called the video one of the earliest known records of Edward's Nazi support.
The fact remains that in 1933, led by a man who was to become Edward VIII, the British royal family were doing Nazi salutes to a video.
The Sun released the video just 3 weeks after the Queen made her first visit to a former Nazi camp in Germany. In a written statement today, Buckingham Palace said it's disappointing that film, shot 8 decades ago and apparently from Her Majesty's personal family archive, has been obtained and exploited in this manner.
Germany will award its highest distinction to Serge and Beate Klausfeld, who have devoted their lives to apprehending Nazi war criminals and bringing them to justice. The couple will receive the Federal Cross of Merit on Monday. 79-year-old Serge Klausfeld is a Romanian-born Jew whose father was murdered in Auschwitz in 1943. His 75-year-old wife, Beate, is the daughter of a German Wehrmacht soldier who says she only began to learn about the Holocaust after meeting her husband in Paris in 1960. She was sentenced to a year in prison at the start of her campaign against the Nazis when she slapped German Chancellor Georg Kissinger across the face in 1968 to remind the German public of his past as a Nazi collaborator. She was also imprisoned in Cologne in 1974 for attempting to kidnap wartime Paris Gestapo chief Kurt Lischke, who was living in France at the time. The couple waged a fierce fight to extradite Nazi war criminal Klaus Barbie from Bolivia to France, who was ultimately convicted in 1987 by a Lyon court. They also helped in the prosecution of French Nazi collaborators Maurice Papot and Paul Tauvier, who were both convicted of their crimes. While commenting on current affairs, Beate Klausfeld told Reuters that while the killing organizations have changed, today's Islamists are willing to kill in cold blood and very difficult to surveil. In Russia, investigation continues into the shooting of a prominent member of the Russian Jewish Congress over the weekend in what may have been an anti-Semitic attack in Moscow. Sergei Ustinov is a 62-year-old businessman and RJC board member who founded the Museum of the History of Jews in Russia in 2011. He is in critical but stable condition after being shot in the neck while in his car by a lone gunman who then fled the scene. The Russian Jewish Congress issued a statement saying that it's too early to draw any concrete conclusions about the motives behind the attack and called on the Minister of Internal Affairs to give special attention to the investigation of the attack to determine if it was committed out of ethnic hatred. IBA's Eli Wogelander spoke to the director of the agency's unit for Russian-speaking Jewry, Roman Polonsky, about current Aliyah from the former Soviet Union and whether those Jewish communities feel there's any future for them there.
First of all, during the last year we saw a huge increase in Aliyah from Ukraine. Aliyah from Ukraine tripled itself. In 13, 2,000 Olim came to Israel. In 14, 6,000. And we see that this trend continues. Of course, the most important reason for this is the war which we don't see in the nearest future. We don't see any end to this war. But also the deterioration in economic situation there. War, of course, affects the situation not only for those people who are there in this war zone, but for other peoples as well. So we see increase in Aliyah, and we serve these people, providing them not only with flights, but also with different programs that here, when we say to them that you can come to Israel and you can be integrated on your level, on the level of your profession, not to start from scratch, you know. This is one thing. Other things, of course, we are making more, we are doing more seminars for them. We are bringing people from Israel who can explain them and to give them just this feeling, what is this to be in Israel, what are their future. And the future, this is what is important for these people, to come to Israel and to know that they have this future. Actually, several days ago, I participated in a big fair Aliyah in Kiev. There were more than 1,000 participants, 1,000 people who came to this, mostly young people with profession in demand in Israel, high educated people, and of course they are welcome. About Russia, we can see also increase in Aliyah mostly from the big cities, but of course there are not numbers like in Ukraine.
Do you hear from the Jewish community in Ukraine, Russia, the FSU, that they're saying to themselves, there is no future for Jews in this country?
Look, with all these big numbers of Aliyah, we speak about approximately 3% of the community there. The community there is 200,000, and 6,000 is 3% of this 3,000. In any case, we see that Aliyah will increase, but in any case, Jews will live there. They will stay there, because Jews know how to live in difficult situations. And that's why our commitment and our obligations, not only for those who come to Israel, but for those who stay there with all our programs like summer camps and Sunday schools and Hebrew studies, because in this specific time, in particular in this time, they're vulnerable and shaken communities need our help, and we have to be there.
A 16-year-old boy was killed and 9 others were injured in a violent brawl that erupted yesterday in the southern Bedouin town of Rahat. 2 homes were set ablaze, and firefighters who arrived at the scene were pelted with stones and other objects. They were forced to withdraw until large forces of police were dispatched to calm the tensions. The fight apparently relates to a month-long dispute between 2 families. No forces were injured in the incident. The Knesset's Committee for Legislation today began discussing a proposed law that will ban the hiring of contract workers. Meanwhile, it appears that the nation is heading towards a crippling general strike this Wednesday. This as negotiations between the Histadrut Labor Federation and the Finance Ministry over the issue of contract workers have failed to yield any progress. Histadrut Chief Avi Nissenkorn is demanding that the state minimize its employment of temporary workers, which he claims are given inadequate contracts with poor salaries, substandard labor conditions, and almost no benefits. There are currently an estimated 400,000 contract workers employed in the workforce, half of whom are in public service. If the strike goes forward in 3 days, it could affect all public services, including the airport, seaports, government offices, and educational facilities. A long list of unionized companies would also be affected, as well as private industry such as cellular and insurance companies. Taking a look at local finance, with no currency trading on Sundays, the shekel remains the same, while share prices on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange started off the trading week in the plus column. Here's a look at the mid-afternoon numbers. And the IBA weather team tells us that we can expect no change in temperatures tomorrow. Here's the forecast at home and abroad over the next 24 hours. And that's all for this newscast. Aaron Viner will be here tomorrow with more news from Israel and abroad. Until then, I'm Laura Cornfield, wishing you a great evening and shalom from Jerusalem.